I think overall the MCU has done a great job in adapting our favorite Marvel stories and characters in a way that works in live action. Sure, it's not perfect and there have been some baffling decisions, but I think in general, most of the big changes the MCU has made while adapting Marvel comics have been successful. But what are some of the most impactful, biggest changes the MCU made? Well, that's what I'm going to talk about today. Thanos' motivation, Ultron's creator, Spider-Man's origins, the original Avengers. I'm talking about them all right now. I think one of the biggest changes to happen to the MCU was altering Thanos' backstory and motivation. In the comics, Thanos is obsessed and in love with Lady Death, and all his major actions are all to impress her. He loves her and wants to cuddle up with her on a Friday night on the couch, watching Friends reruns in their PJs. Obviously, the MCU changed that, but what I've always found funny is that they seem to almost keep it. In the first Avengers movie, we cut to a very different looking Thanos in the post-credit sequence, and his little minion talks about courting death, which makes the big purple alien smile. Did the little minion know at that point that Thanos was sending secret "Do you like me? Check the box, yes or no" messages to Lady Death? But that didn't unfold the way we expected. The Infinity Saga became about a Thanos who had witnessed the destruction of his planet and saw himself as the universe's greatest hero in trying to save it from itself. Sure, he sat around on a big floating chair for like 8 movies when he really should have just been doing things for himself.
Fine. I'll do it myself.
But when he did finally spring into action, he was able to wipe out half the universe with one snap. Now the question becomes, do you think the changes to Thanos' character made his character better? I love what they did with Thanos, but I wonder how different the MCU would look right now if they kept his character as some lovesick psycho who thinks wiping out half the universe would get the girl he likes to like him back. In the comics, Hank Pym created Ultron because he was dabbling with advanced robotics and it immediately went poorly for him. Ultron ended up gaining sentience, turning evil, and then brainwashing Hank into forgetting he ever created Ultron in the first place. Comics are fun. Hank creating Ultron is a major part of the comics, but when the MCU decided to make Age of Ultron, it was doing so without a Hank Pym. In fact, it was kind of darkly funny that when they announced their Phase 2 slate, Ant-Man's movie would come out after Age of Ultron. But anyways, although this wasn't comic accurate, I'll actually say that this change fit better with the overall story. If you follow Iron Man's character arc in the MCU, you can see after the Avengers how he was terrified of not being able to protect Earth from outside threats. After flying through the wormhole and seeing what was on the other side, Tony knew that someone like Thanos would eventually come knocking and wanted to go about creating a suit of armor around the Earth. So Tony, along with Bruce, set out to create Ultron. That tracks on a story level. If they had introduced Hank Pym as the creator of Ultron in Age of Ultron, it would be comic accurate, but it wouldn't give the story as high of stakes and emotional investment. That's why I'm always fine with changes that work better for the story and the characters. Although on the flip side, Tony's actions in Age of Ultron continued the trend of Tony makes horrible decisions that I wish didn't become so common in the MCU. Speaking of that, let's talk about Civil War. Like a lot of these entries, I have to start by asking the question, did you like the adaptation? To me, Civil War is top 5 or top, I don't know, probably 8 MCU movies. There's a lot of good ones. They do a great job in helping you maybe not agree with both sides, but at least seeing why each character believes what they believe. But if you were a Marvel Comics Civil War superfan, you might be a little disappointed over how they chose to adapt this story. But let's be real, there wasn't really a proper way to adapt this very big, all-encompassing story, and I like a lot of the changes. In the comics, the inciting incident was this: a low-level, inexperienced group of heroes fought a group of villains, and one of the villains, named Nitro, exploded and killed hundreds of people. And while that opened the door for questions about reining in the multitude of superheroes out there in the world, the MCU took a different approach. They made Wanda somewhat responsible for causing the explosion, but gave her enough wiggle room where the blame wasn't entirely on her. And boy, glad they didn't make Wanda into too much a villain in that movie, right? She's a hero after all. Anyway, by making it one of their own who was sort of responsible for the explosion, it made the story more impactful. It's also interesting that in the Marvel comic, Spider-Man plays a crucial role in being caught in the middle of Iron Man and Captain America's ideology, leading to him publicly unmasking himself in support of Iron Man. While Spidey didn't go that far in Civil War, we did see him ultimately and wholeheartedly take Team Iron Man's side.
You couldn't have done that earlier?
And on the topic of Spider-Man, let's talk about his origins. This entry is the start of a trend I've noticed where the MCU will make a change to the comic book at first, but then slowly work their way back to something more comic accurate. Spider-Man is a great example of this. When he's introduced, he's immediately on track to become Iron Man Jr. He gets taken under Tony's metal wing, he gets a fancy and out-of-this-world suit, and he's on track to become a young member of the Avengers. And sure, Spider-Man Homecoming sees Peter reject Tony's offer to become part of the team because he wants to keep his feet on the ground a while longer.
I'm gonna pretend you didn't say that.
But he's still pretty well off. And while that's great and all, that's so different from Spidey in the comics, who is such a beloved character because of how tough his life is. The core of Spider-Man's character is that whenever he tends to win, he also loses slightly. He can never be truly happy because he can't fully devote himself to the Peter Parker side and the Spider-Man side of his life.
Hey, Aunt May. Yeah? Eggs? Organic, got it.
With great power
Comes great responsibility.
and all that. But now we seem to be getting back to that. With Aunt May dying and giving Peter the great responsibility speech, followed by Peter ditching the Stark suit to rock his own homemade outfit, while no one remembers who he is, feels like classic Spider-Man. I know I'm excited to see a more street-level Spidey in the next few years. I think all the Mandarin and Wenwu choices the MCU made is another example of them retconning their history. The Mandarin twist in Iron Man 3 still stands as one of the more controversial choices the MCU made. It felt like with the introduction of the Ten Rings terrorist group in the first Iron Man, that Iron Man 3 would bring that full circle by having the Mandarin be the villain of the third movie. He's one of Tony's greatest enemies after all. Of course, the movie pulled the rug out from under us by having the Mandarin being revealed to just be a washed-up actor named Trevor, and Aldrich Killian being the real bad guy. It felt like the negative response to the twist led the MCU to quickly come out and say, oh no, the real Mandarin is still out there, don't worry. Then the MCU got a chance to fix that with Shang-Chi by introducing the real Mandarin as a powerful and compelling villain whose real name was Wenwu. This was technically another change as Mandarin isn't Shang-Chi's father in the comics, but in the end I think it all worked out. What started as the MCU making a controversial change to the Mandarin led them to making an overall excellent change later on, so that's balanced, right? One of the more recent changes the MCU made has to do with Ms. Marvel. The show introduced her with a big change to her powers and then boom, hit us with another huge change at the end of the series. In the comics, her powers are sort of like Mr. Fantastic and Ant-Man rolled into one. She's stretchy in the way she can grow and shrink parts of her body at will. She can also alter her appearance with her powers. Now, of course, the MCU has their Ms. Marvel as something similar to Green Lantern in a sense. She can cast light projections of almost anything she imagines. And while this change proved a little controversial, I get it. In comics, it's incredibly easy to draw an elastic person, but in live action, I still don't think we've mastered that. Plus, I liked how they tied in Kamala's powers with her family history. But just when we were all used to that change, the powers that be were quick to hit us with another huge change. At the end of the series, we learn that Kamala's powers happened because she has a mutation in her genes. Just in case the implication wasn't clear, they played the X-Men theme song from the animated show around her.
Like a mutation.
Ms. Marvel is now a mutant, which is a huge change from her Inhuman backstory from the comics. How this will affect things going forward is still unclear, as we'll have to wait for the Marvels movie to find out more. In the MCU, there are 6 OG Avengers: Iron Man, Captain America, Hulk, Thor, Black Widow, and Hawkeye. And while there's generally a good balance of powers and abilities, and it's all worked out for the best, I can't help but wonder how the MCU would look if they kept the original Avengers lineup. In the comics, the roster is Iron Man, Hulk, Thor, Ant-Man, and the Wasp. If the MCU would have gone this route, do you think we'd still have Scott Lang? Or do you think we'd have a younger Hank Pym and Janet Van Dyne? How would the dynamic have changed if there were 2 shrinking people and another arrogant smart person in the mix? Plus, there's no Captain America. Maybe what they could have done was have the first Avengers still with Cap frozen, and then defrosted him after the team had assembled, like in the comics. How different would everything look then? The first Guardians of the Galaxy movie was a huge risk that paid off. At the time, it was taking a bunch of unknown, slightly weird characters and setting it within the MCU, and everything worked out great. The first film was a smash hit, and we all fell in love with Star-Lord, Drax, Gamora, Rocket, and Groot. And while their team dynamic was close to perfection, in my opinion, that's still a big change from the source material. In the comics, the first Guardians of the Galaxy team had none of those members on it. The original lineup consisted of Vance Astro, Martin X Tanaga, Captain Charlie 27, and Yondu. So yes, for any big fan of the OG Guardians team, it was strange to see Yondu in a more antagonistic role in that first movie, at least at first. I can't imagine now seeing the original version of the team, which had the Guardians exist in the 31st century in an alternate timeline, but with the end of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 introducing some of the older characters, who knows what the future holds. Alright, another villain change I wanted to talk about. Since I just mentioned the Guardians of the Galaxy, I wanted to talk about Ego the Living Planet. In the MCU, they changed Ego's backstory to not only be Peter Quill's father, but also made him a Celestial. Now, that first change wasn't really an issue. Peter's father in the comics isn't an important enough character where that change felt monumental, and it gave the Guardians a fun villain to fight. But with the Celestial thing, that one's a bit more of a head-scratcher. At the time of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, it was a little unclear what the MCU had planned for the Celestials. Certainly, the Eternals weren't going to be a big thing yet, right? Because by stating that Ego was a Celestial instead of just a regular giant sentient planet, it creates a curious mystery in today's MCU. We've seen a few Celestials now, thanks to the Eternals, and they don't act like Ego at all. I mean, can you imagine Ego and Arishem the Judge hanging out together and discussing celestial matters? Was Ego the black sheep of the Celestial family? Did they turn and run whenever Ego showed up to group dinners? That's something I hope they don't sweep under the rug. Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver's origins were another example of the MCU changing an origin to fit with their story, but then after a few years retconning it to make it more comic accurate. When the twins were introduced, it was during a time where the magical side of the MCU was still in its early phases. Everything was tech or alien based. Just think of Thor saying that what we call magic on Earth is just science to the Asgards. It's like there was a fear of making things too complicated or mystical, which led to revised backstories for Wanda and Pietro. In the MCU, they changed their story to say they were actually experimented on, and it was the Mind Stone that ended up giving them their superpowers. It was only at the start of Phase 4 with WandaVision that they decided to embrace a more comic-accurate origin. They retconned things to say that Wanda's magical abilities were dormant inside of her the whole time, and all the Mind Stone did was bring them out. I'm really happy with this change to the change, aren't you? Let's add another villain to this list. One change that benefited the MCU was actually Killmonger's origins. The MCU delivered an all-time great villain in Killmonger, and the movie made a smart choice to tweak the villain's backstory to have him be directly related to T'Challa and thus have a legitimate claim to the throne. By establishing that connection with Black Panther, it made the movie 50 times more compelling and set up a dramatic conflict. If Killmonger was just your run-of-the-mill bad guy who wanted to take over the throne because of evil purposes, then I think that movie becomes way more generic and less memorable. If there's one character we're all hoping to see show up in a Thor movie, it's Beta Ray Bill. The Corbinite has become a fan-favorite comic character, but whenever he does show up, he's going to have a major change to his story. In the comics, Beta Ray Bill proved to be worthy of Mjolnir, leading to a battle with Thor, and afterwards he was given Stormbreaker as a bit of a consolation prize. Obviously, the MCU changed that to make Stormbreaker a Thanos-killing weapon, so if Bill does show up now, how would you fit him into the story? Would you have him try to steal Stormbreaker away from Thor, or do you give him a whole new weapon entirely? Okay, this one is just a minor change, but one that worked wonders for the whole franchise. In the first Iron Man movie, instead of having a human butler named Jarvis, they made it so Jarvis was actually an AI and could assist Tony in his suits as he flew around.
Sir, there are still terabytes of calculations needed before an actual flight is achieved.
Jarvis, sometimes you gotta run before you can walk.
I think it's one of the brilliant tiny changes that film did that helped lay the groundwork for the entire MCU. And think of the butterfly effect here. Since Jarvis was an AI, Paul Bettany got to voice the character, and that led to him getting to play Vision. But I guess, I don't know, seeing all the Vision makeup Bettany had to go through, maybe he wishes he could have played a butler instead. With the Ant-Man movie choosing to focus on an older, retired Hank Pym and letting Scott Lang get to have all the shrinking fun, it created a bit of a conundrum with Wasp. Obviously, Ant-Man needs a Wasp, but the character of Hope Pym, which Evangeline Lilly's Hope Van Dyne is based on, is actually a villain in the comics. She's from the MC2 universe and is actually the supervillain known as Red Queen. Man, wouldn't it have been crazy if Hope was actually a bad guy in the first Ant-Man movie? But I'm glad they made this change. Having Ant-Man with an incredibly competent partner has made his movies even more enjoyable. I talked a lot about heroes and villains with tweaked backstory, so I thought I would end this video with a curveball and mention a mentor. Mar-Vell in the MCU was a scientist who helped use the Space Stone's energy to develop a light-speed engine. She later went undercover on Earth as Wendy Lawson and worked on Project Pegasus. That all works for the movie, but anyone who was expecting a more traditional Mar-Vell interpretation might have been taken aback a bit, especially because Mar-Vell in the comics was the first Captain Marvel. Now, that would have made for an interesting story, but they couldn't really tell that story in the MCU. And for now, I'm happy Carol is the first Captain Marvel and not following in someone else's footsteps. What about things that were sort of changed and sort of adapted correctly? I think of Hulk's storyline in Ragnarok and how that's perhaps the closest we'll ever get to see a full-on Planet Hulk storyline. Should that have been adapted differently? Should any of these changes have happened? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching CBR. See you next time.